This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. This week, I'm joined by gardener and conservationist by trade, Sue Mabberley, from Nant-y-Bedd, a remarkable garden in the Black Mountains that's evolved over 4 decades into a thriving haven for wildlife. We talk about gardening with nature rather than against it, the value of so-called weeds, and how even the smallest patch of land can play a role in supporting biodiversity.
So how did I get into horticulture? Well, I have to hold my hand up here, Sarah, which is why you might want to say, OK, let's leave it here. I'm not a horticulturalist. My background is in public sector environmental organisations in Wales, and horticulture has always been a hobby. So I suppose I got into horticulture, if you want to call it that. I'd like to call it gardening, actually, because I grew up in a farming family. So my dad was a farmer and what in those days was called a market gardener. So I would help pick the peas on a Friday afternoon and things like that after school. And both sets of grandparents were farmers locally. And so that's the background. But I went to a grammar school and went on to kind of, drop out of school as you do when you're 17 and things like that. And your parents don't like your boyfriend. And then my first job was working for a library, which I loved, a really wonderful job. And then I kind of dropped into the kind of environmental thing almost accidentally because I left work to have my eldest daughter. And as one did in those days, you didn't just take maternity leave. It was quite common to actually, as a woman, leave your job when you had a baby. And then when I applied for my own job back, when it became available, I was told that, they wouldn't employ me because my child was far too young and I'd be taking time off all the time. So I chucked my toys out the pram and went to work for the Forestry Commission. So kind of changed direction, if you like, into kind of the environmental sector. And there's lots of history. So over the years, I worked for various public sector organisations. So the Forestry Commission, I worked for the Brecon Beacons National Park I was head warden there for 10 years, and then I moved to the Countryside Council for Wales, which is the equivalent of Natural England, I think you've got there. And then that became Natural Resources Wales, which is who I ended up working for when I retired about 14 years ago. So none of that is horticulture. But in amongst all of that, I did a degree with the University of Wales. When I was working full-time, I was doing a full-time degree with 2 children and a terminally ill husband. And you kind of look back and wonder how you did it. But the degree was environmental systems, so it was a combined studies degree, and it included all sorts of things. So I'm not a specialist in anything. I regard myself very much as a generalist, and it suited me absolutely fine because we did everything from water chemistry and river pollution on one hand, most of which went straight over my head, right through to the social sciences and all of that stuff on the other side. And in between, there were things like protected landscapes and ecology and ecosystems and biodiversity and all of those sorts of things. So it suited me very well. And the horticulture, if you want what you want to call what I do here, horticulture, is informed by my interest in landscapes and ecology and biodiversity. So having said that, we do grow food crops, but there's been lots of changes in that over the years. But so not a horticulturalist, really. I regard myself as a gardener and caretaker of the land, I suppose.
And so when you got your garden where you are now, did you have a vision for it, or has it developed over time? And if so, what has it become over the years that you've been there?
Well, to start with, I've been here 46 years, so moved here in 1980 when my late husband and I got married. He was a forester with the Forestry Commission, and he was a keen gardener too. In those days, the house went with the job. That's how we came to be here, because people often say, well, why on earth did you come to a place like this to create a garden when, it's 1,200 feet up in the Black Mountains, short growing seasons, lots of shade, all of that kind of stuff. And in those days, I'm sure some people who might hear what I'm saying will remember John Seymour and self-sufficiency and all that kind of vibe that was going on in the late 70s, 1980s. So the gardening then was all about growing our own food. We had goats. I made goat's cheese and yogurts and baked my own bread and preserved lots of jam, and the freezer was full with all sorts of things. So that's the kind of gardening that it was then. And over the years, it's changed a lot. So my husband died 30 years ago, over 30 years ago now. And so the garden then became my garden. And quite gradually, I suppose, I started doing things differently. I mean, we've always been an organic garden, so that's absolutely fundamental to how we garden here. I often forget to say that because, it's kind of no-brainer, really. Why would you want to do it any other way? Respect for nature and natural systems is absolutely fundamental to how we look after the place. But there became, I guess, more interest in the wildflowers and the things that we were sharing the space with, and learning more about the creatures that we were sharing the space with and what their needs were. So I was very keen on insects and birds and all of that sort of thing, and curious to find out about what they needed. So nest sites for birds and all that sort of thing, all the obvious things. Over the years, learning more and more about all of that and the interconnections between different things. And so I suppose the emphasis became more, rather than production of food, it turned more into a space for wildlife and growing food as well. And then moving forward again over the years, I have a very good friend, Liz Knight, who runs foraging events. She lives a couple of valleys over, and she's been teaching foraging here for about 10 years now. So growing up in the countryside as a farmer's daughter, as a child, you were told you could eat the blackberries and the hedgerows, and you could eat, we eat the mushrooms that grow in that field because we know they're field mushrooms and they're safe to eat. And basically everything else is poisonous. So my knowledge of wild plants as food was zero, pretty much. I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly for the benefit of a good story. But really from Liz, I've learned about lots and lots of things that we can eat that most people fight shy of. I mean, back in the days of Richard Maby's food for free, I dipped my toe into the water then, if you like. And yeah, we had nettle soup and things like that. But Liz has turned it very much more into something that you can pick a bit of this, pick a bit of that, and make a salad from, 17 ingredients, for example, was one I produced when we had the family home for Easter. And none of it was crops that I'd grown specifically as salad crops. They were just picking bits and pieces of hairy bittercress, ground elder, and so on and so forth. So that influenced the way that I garden too. The aesthetics is really important as well. So I'm not a garden designer, and I've always been quite rude about garden designers, really, because I think nature does it best. Plants seem to know where they want to grow. So it's the Beth Chatto thing, right plant, right place. But really, that, and I've learned more and more over the years as I've tried to grow even, quite ordinary things that most gardeners would regard as something not difficult at all, like the Mediterranean herbs, rosemary and sage and things like that, which every garden has. If if you've got a kitchen and you like using your own herbs, they just don't overwinter here, so those are in the greenhouse. But what I can grow is things like mosses, ferns, lichens, and all of those sorts of things, which some other gardeners struggle to grow. So I think over the years, it's by observation, learning more and more about what's happy growing here, rather than imposing my will, if you want to put it like that. And not wanting to control. I really don't like those sorts of militaristic words about controlling and fighting an invasion of, what do you do about the kind of pernicious weeds? Well, we don't have pernicious weeds. We kind of welcome them all, really. They all have their place and they're here for a purpose because, some things feed on them or what have you. So it's been a whole gradual change over the years, and now more and more my garden, because you've been here, looks wilder and wilder all the time. And I think this is why I enjoy taking people on garden tours, because I can explain to them what's going on, because the general garden visitor, somebody who just wants any old garden to go on a Sunday afternoon because it's somewhere to take the mother-in-law, I'm being a bit rude here, but some people who just want a nice pretty garden that's got nice neat edges and striped lawns would be very disappointed with my garden. But anybody who's interested in what sort of plants can grow together and what plants are absolutely fantastic as larval food plants for the caterpillar of the elephant hawk moth, for example, would learn lots by having a conversation with me as they were walking through the potager, for example, which at the moment is looking absolutely glorious. One end of it completely full of ground elder, which most gardeners, if they have it in their garden, will have spent years trying to poison it or dig it up and think it's evil, whereas actually it's a fantastic plant in the garden. So yeah, big changes over the years, and really I think fundamentally the difference is between having an idea of what I want to do with a piece of land for my benefit has changed completely to what can I do for this piece of land to make it as natural and good for biodiversity generally as I possibly can. And the fact that we can eat some things as we go along and we enjoy watching the birds and the butterflies and so on and so forth is an added bonus. And the fact that it looks nice, and yes, we do mow the lawns and all of that sort of thing. It's the balance, really. The balance is tipped towards the wildness rather than production of food.
I mean, you've touched there on my next question, which was, did you do that? Did you gradually change and shift towards wildlife benefit because you were interested in it? Or was it because you felt that the wildlife value of spaces outside the garden was diminishing, therefore you needed to do your bit? Was there a kind of overarching motivation behind it?
I mean, the first thing that kind of alerted me to that actually I was doing things differently was we used to open the garden to the National Garden Scheme for about 15 years. And so we get loads of visitors all in one day, all lovely people, and enjoy their tea and cake. And one of the visitors said, "Oh, yours is a very interesting garden. It's really quite different. I see you've got wildflowers growing in your flower beds." And up until that point, I hadn't actually realised that I did. They had their place because they were there, they were decorative, they were covering the ground. That's the other thing, we don't have any bare soil. And I suppose that was a kind of awareness that I was actually doing things differently. I do get a bit preachy sometimes. I give lots of talks to garden clubs, U3A groups, that sort of thing. And really what I'm trying to encourage people to do is to actually rip up the plastic grass, get rid of the concrete drives. We all need to do our own little bit. If we're fortunate to have a little patch of the planet, we can do better. I get so downhearted when, perfectly intelligent, well-educated people who have money and all that kind of stuff, spray their walls with bleach because they don't want weeds, in inverted commas, growing in them. And they spray along their fence lines because they don't want the weeds. And some of these people are the people who will go to garden centres and buy the plants that probably grown in peat and come from Holland and all the rest of it and sprayed and so on. They have a pollinator-friendly label in them. They think they're doing the right thing by doing that, but they don't actually understand that it's much more fundamental, that we need to be looking after the land in a different way. Sterility, I think, is the one thing that I really despair about with the way that people, you need somewhere for your kids to kick around a football if you've got a young family. That's all perfectly fine, but actually just to put down plastic grass because it's easier, and to mow everything and, not even have hedges, to have, it just really worries me. And I do my best to try and encourage people to understand a little bit that it's all very complex, and I don't pretend to understand it all, but I just think the more range of habitats and diversity of plant life that we can provide in our garden, then the better the planet will be. Even, if everybody who had a garden or a piece of land did their little bit, then that's a huge amount of stuff going on which will support wildlife. Because if you look at the outside of the gardens, the countryside generally, coming from a farming family, I've seen the changes over the years, from small scale farming, the kind my dad used to do, where you'd lay the hedges, and you'd have some livestock, but you'd make your hay so that things had a an opportunity to live in the hay meadows and so on. That's by and large gone from a lot of the countryside now, and as everybody knows, it's we all want cheap food. So people aren't prepared or are not able to afford to pay the price of what it costs to produce food. So agriculture has got more and more industrialised over the years. Farmers have done exactly what successive governments have asked them to do, which is to be, produce cheaper food and be more profitable and all of that. But the consequence of that, of course, has been, diminishing habitats for some of our species of things like, in Wales, it would be things like the loss of forests and wet meadows and those sorts of things have all gone because the land has been drained to increase productivity and so on. So yeah, doing our bit. And when I retired from the day job, my intention was to spend more time in the garden over the years, going back decades, I did my bit on going on protest marches. I was a member of Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and all of that kind of stuff. And there's wonderful people doing tremendous stuff with, organisations that are calling for change. But I think at my stage of life, I think what I can do for the best is to look after my piece of land in the best way I know how. And that's why we open the garden to the public, so we can share it with other people and we can show them what we're doing here and hope that they might think about doing things differently if they've got their own gardens.
So you mentioned the ground elder and that you'd leave that. I think a lot of people do have good intentions, but when it comes to managing the space, they struggle to make up a kind of criteria for which plant to leave and which plant to take out. And I'm guessing, your garden will take some editing. Do you have a checklist that you say, okay, well, that plant's behaving here and it's useful and therefore it can stay, or does aesthetics come into it? How do you personally make a decision about whether a plant stays or goes?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, all this has come gradually. And, it changes all the time. I mean, a good example would be shiny cranesbill, for example. Most people will regard that as a weed. And if, on the patio, for example, where I've got things in pots and things planted around, shiny cranesbill pops up, most people would weed that out because they didn't plant it and it's a weed. But I leave it because it's a really pretty flower. Then what I was doing with that is that as it started to go over, maybe it had dried out a bit or something, and then it started going to seed, and it started looking aesthetically not very attractive, I would weed it out. It would go on the compost heap. Until a few years back, I just happened to notice some activity and realised it was bullfinches feeding on the seed heads of the shiny cranesbill. So that was a kind of, light bulb moment. Yes, seed-eating birds need seeds to eat throughout the year. And if we just put feeders out in the winter, with sunflower seeds in or something, that's actually not what they need. They need things to eat throughout the year. So more and more seed heads get left. And so with regarding what plants to take out, it's getting more and more difficult because, for example, hogweed, you think, why would I want common hogweed in the garden? Well, first of all, Liz has educated me to know that it's edible. So I'm not talking about giant hogweed now, but common hogweed is edible. Not time to go into the detail there, but yeah, it is edible and delicious. And the seeds are edible and delicious, used as a spice. And so over the years that Liz has been coming here, I've been thinking, well, I'm not going to weed all the hogweed out because Liz will want some to talk about when she's here foraging. And of course, I forget to collect the seed heads up before the seeds drop. So I've got far more hogweed than is sensible, really, particularly in the potager. But having said that, what I tend to do this time of the year in terms of weeding stuff out that I don't want to be there, I don't actually dig out the weeds. That's the other thing that I haven't said about how we manage the garden now. We're completely no dig, so we don't dig, and we're managing it more with polycultures rather than single crops in places, and looking at permaculture techniques. So we're permanent crops, so lots more perennial crops. But just going back to the weeding, if a dock, for example, pops up in the middle of, the onion bed, it's actually, for some of its time, can look quite attractive in the right place. A couple of docks going on there. And of course, the seeds for the birds are good. But actually, we're getting increasingly, with climate change, we're getting a lot of blustery swirling storms with terrific swirling winds, and of course that bashes everything down. So the weeding tends to be informed by what gets bashed across the paths. So obviously we're open to visitors during the summer, during June and July. So if the weeds are across the path, then visitors will trample on them, and that doesn't look pretty. So stuff gets cut back when it's bashed across the path, or if it's kind of, a 45-degree angle or something like that. But rather than try and dig it up, because the planting is so dense, I just cut it off. So with a pair of shears. So, and then that goes either to the compost heap, or we've got a few sheep, so sometimes it just gets lobbed over the fence for the sheep. Sheep love hogweed, for example, going back to my example of hogweed. So not everything goes on the compost heap. And we do a lot of chop and drop as well. So we have a no bare earth policy here. So rather than everything going to the compost heap, some stuff just gets chopped down, particularly going back to weeds and weeding out, things that I don't want to introduce into the composting system with the results of perhaps moving them around the garden. So we talked about ground elder, so we keep the ground elder where it is by and large and cut it down where it is, and then tuck it under a hedge where I've already got ground elder, so it's not dropping seeds into the composting system. And the other one that's a good example here is enchanter's nightshade, which I'm bound to have because it's in the forest all around us. And it's in one of the fruit cages amongst the raspberries and the black currants and red currants, where actually the management technique there is just to cut it down before it seeds and leave it where it is. So again, it's chop and drop, just leave it where it is so we're not spreading it around the garden. So weeding is not as straightforward as saying, oh, I allow some things because they're good and I don't allow other things because they're bad. It depends where they are, what time of year it is, and so on and so forth. So I'm very fortunate to have some volunteers who come to help me in the garden. And when I take on new volunteers, we spend a lot of time trying to, first of all, early on in the year, it's all about seedling identification, because we use a lot of self-seeders here, and it's very important to be able to tell what plants are at the seedling stage, including the weeds. So some weeds, inverted commas, we might leave there because they're, for example, red campion or other self-seeders, garden plants like forget-me-nots, will actually leave as ground cover and then, deal with those in a different way. But the important thing for people helping me in the garden is to try to get into the same sort of way of looking at weeds that I see. And that can be quite difficult, actually. Yeah, so I do treat weeds rather differently from most gardeners.
And has it reduced your workload in the garden, do you think?
No, because people look at my garden and think, oh, this is a low maintenance garden. If I didn't do anything, my garden could look like this. It could look lovely and I wouldn't have to do anything. No, it's not like that at all. Because if I didn't do anything, it would look a mess. And that's not what I want. There has to be the contrast between, I'm looking now out at the bit that I call under the washing line, which at the moment is looking absolutely glorious. It's full of oxeye daisy, cat's ear, fox and cubs, and then shortly they'll be joined by flowering knapweed. It's full of sorrels and so on and so forth. And that is a joy, but in terms of looking after it, so that's a bank that we used to trim regularly during the summer to keep it looking neat and tidy. So yes, in terms of does it make less work? Yeah, there's certainly less trimming, but in terms of keeping that looking nice, it's making sure things aren't flopping over the path, and then if things get really bashed by the storms, or if dogs come up through it and are not in the right place, then they'll get snipped off and so on. And then those banks will get cut down once a year. So having said it, it's not less work. I suppose using that particular example, it is less work because it only gets cut down once a year. And then what we cut off, because it's full of grass seed, just gets tucked under the hedge. But I think the difference is it's constant attention is what's required in the way that I garden here. So it's intervention in very small ways. For example, today I should have had 2 volunteers here. Far too hot, so we decided neither of them were able to do an early shift, which is what we've done before when it's been very hot. And even though we've got lots of shade, it's not comfortable temperature for working today. So instead, I've just been dipping in and out, with gently trimming back one of the paths. I've been down to the pond and clearing some of the debris, the overwintered debris that we hadn't got around to clearing up, processing stuff onto the compost heap. So just little bits and pieces. So it's not the kind of gardening that I guess you could do if you had a busy full-time job, busy life, and you didn't employ a gardener. Having said that, that's not true actually, because my daughter's got quite a small garden, but has picked up a lot of the ideas from here. Both daughters gardening, very much influenced by how we look after the land here. So you can replicate this on a smaller scale. I guess what I'm thinking about is this is 10 acres and it requires my constant attention. Whereas if you had a small, ordinary sized garden, yeah, you can adopt some of these things and, enjoy the wildlife too.
I was thinking, again, as you were talking, obviously there's time constraints, there's practical considerations. Like you said, if kids want to play football on the lawn, then there's that. And I like to think the message is trickling through about gardening for biodiversity. But what do you think is the main thing that might be holding people back when they think about it?
I think it's probably time, actually. They haven't got time to do it like that. People have such busy lives and their lives are so full that it's easier just to have plastic grass or mow it all. People have busy lives, and I think it's how people choose to use their time, I think.
I think that's the crux. Funnily enough, I had this conversation about 2 hours ago. I was speaking to somebody who's a landscape architect, and she was saying, I don't think it's lack of time. I think it's that people need a priority shift.
Okay, yeah.
You can make time for stuff when you want to do it, but it's that need and want to do it. So maybe that's the shift that needs to happen. In terms of what you've got coming up, you said about July and August. Have you got anything that you want to mention that's coming up?
Yeah, the garden is open Thursdays and Fridays during June and July. So the only weekend opening is a weekend opening for St Michael's Hospice, which is Sunday, the 19th of July, and the booking for that is through St Michael's Hospice, not through us, but if anybody's interested, they could contact us and we could give them the link. And the other thing I'd mention is some workshops. I mean, Liz has a couple of foraging half days. The details are on our website. There's one in July and one in August. We've also got a joint workshop with me and Jo McKerr, spending the whole day exploring garden meadows. So Jo has a wonderful garden in Wellow in Somerset, and she has, I guess she wouldn't mind me calling it, designed meadows. Whereas here we've got an ex-agricultural meadow, which we're managing for biodiversity and aesthetics. And also my meadowy bits, like the bit I was describing earlier up under the washing line, which I've been playing about with for, the last 40 years, really. So that's the Garden Meadows workshop. And again, the details are on the website in July. And I've just put in another compost workshop on the 2nd of August. I am passionate about making compost, and soil health, which we haven't talked about at all, is absolutely fundamental to the way we garden here. So I had a few people interested in doing a compost workshop, so we put an extra date in. That's only just gone onto the website, so there's space available on that one too.
Thanks to Sue for a great chat. If you liked today's episode, you might also enjoy episode 194, Gardening for Wildlife, and episode 333, Designing for Habitat and Biodiversity. You'll find links to both in the show notes, and as always, thank you for listening. Next up is Benny with his insect of the week.
The yellow loosestrife bee, scientific name Macropis europaea. Today's insect of the week is a bee. I'm very fond of bees, and this one was kind of interesting to me from the very first time I heard about it. The Macropis genus contains only one bee in the UK and Ireland. There's another bee that is found on the continent, but it's not known to be here yet. It's a very interesting and unique bee. It's pretty much a specialist on yellow loosestrife. The reason why I say pretty much is that there is evidence that the extremely closely related yellow loosestrife they may occasionally collect pollen from, but we don't have too much evidence of that. So the female only collects pollen off Lysimachia vulgaris, a damp, marginal plant often found around waterways and ponds. It's a plant that I tell everybody to put around ponds constantly, just to try and get this bee to be able to spread. So this bee is found near waterways and ponds typically. It's actually only distributed in the records in the southeast of the UK and Ireland. But it could possibly spread. There could be more locations where it's found, but it's just the records don't exist yet. It's really quite a unique looking bee, although the person I was showing yesterday didn't seem to think it was, but your eyes are tuned to the nuances and the subtleties of different species. But it's got really interesting shaped back legs, and it uses these in a couple of interesting ways, not just collecting pollen for the females, but she also collects floral oils to use as a waterproofing agent, which is just fantastic. So you imagine if you're collecting pollen from plants that exist around waterways, you want to nest nearby ideally. So she would nest typically around ponds and waterways in soft mud, banks, mini verticals, but these places could be submerged in, half the year in wet places. So plenty of species of bee can have their nest cells submerged or very damp for some of the winter. I was told that desiccation is more of an issue than being flooded out. So just to combat the fact that it could be a long period underwater for this species, that she collects the floral oils as a waterproofing agent. So she uses her back legs to mix floral oils with pollen, which is really cool. A waterproofing agent, and that's collected from the plant itself typically. So yellow loosestrife, Lizzie-Mackia vulgaris. Lizzie-Mackia vulgaris apparently doesn't produce nectar. So this bee and the males will be drinking nectar off other plants nearby. I've seen them on all sorts of things like gypsywort and asters and what else have they go on? Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff. But birchfoot trefoils, water mint, and umbellifers, as always. Alder buckthorn as well, according to the literature. Dotted loosestrife is another important plant, but not quite as important plant for the species. So dotted loosestrife is Lizzie-Mackia punctata. And the female may collect pollen from this as well, but the evidence is more closely tied, and all the evidence I see, with Lizzie-Mackia vulgaris. So you must plant this plant around your pond, just in case this bee could turn up. Apparently it's got quite good distribution ability, so it can move from one site to another to create new sites relatively well. Just stunning. If you look at a picture of this bee, it's just really gorgeous. So it's Macropis europaea, the yellow loosestrife bee, the only bee in the genus in the UK, almost completely reliant on our native yellow loosestrife in damp conditions. So what's your excuse not to plant this plant, just in case this bee turns up? On that note, a very emotional time for me recently, because I've been planting this plant in the Eden Nature Garden in Clapham in London about 4 or 5 years ago, and it's quite a slow one to establish, especially because our garden's very dry, even near the pond. And the bee just turned up yesterday. So it was a very emotional moment. I was even talking to someone about this plant and the bee that I was hoping that turned up, and then I spotted it. So it was quite a thing. And sometimes with these specialist bees and plant relationships, if you do plant the plant, the species can turn up, and that's a direct bit of conservation or nature restoration you're doing. And don't forget, with specialists and their relationship with plants, if you cater for specialists, you're also catering for many generalists, because generalists are often very unfussy at times. So start with the specialists, help them, because you'll always be helping generalists at the same time. So please keep an eye out. There is a short window when yellow loosestrife is flowering and is present, so there's only a small window for this bee to be seen. So go to ponds, have a look, have a closer look, spend a little bit more time, spend 20 minutes looking at the plant like I do. And you never know, we found new sites where this bee is present. As always, please record your sightings on the iRecord and iNaturalist app, and I really hope you find one.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.